Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keval Hari, and I am the Executive Director of the Gala Queer Archive. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel, particularly because Gala has had a long-standing partnership with the Governing Intimacies, which is sponsored by the Miller Foundation and based at Wits University. And a partnership that has been particularly rewarding and also very important for us. One of the saddest things about COVID, and there's a lot to be sad about, was that we were planning this very exciting conference in Maputo, which would have happened last year in May. And so I'm really glad that we're having these sets of conversations in a kind of new world setting, because it's allowed us to at least have these important conversations and meet each other in this space. So the Gala Queer Archive was started in 1997 and was really a response to this proposition of homosexuality being un-African, which was heard all across the continent at the time and continues to be heard. And I think queer archives are particularly important, one, because they offer us with an opportunity to reimagine history. And by reimagining history, they allow for a restoration of dignity, particularly for queer people. But I think also importantly, it offers archives with an opportunity for redemption. Because historical archives, and particularly those of colonial, within colonial settings, haven't always treated people fairly. I think queer archives also, in that sense, challenge the very notion of what an archive is. Because I had written here, and I now realize that it sounds super cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyway, because queer archives literally think down, flip it, and reverse it, in the words of Missy Elliott. And I think on some level that is important, because nothing about a queer archive is traditional. Its obsession with one, intimate, and intimacy. And perhaps that's because people have always been obsessed with what queer people are doing in the bedroom. And so it's often intimate, deeply personal, with differences in recollections of memory, all of which are challenged, but ultimately accepted if there's an affirmation of queer existence, which I think is very important. And in relation to that, I think queer archives also allow for opportunities of critical self-reflection. And I think in that sense, we're in a very important moment, particularly in terms of considering conversations around the global South of what a post-colonial queer archive means. One that specifically speaks to a Western experience of queer life. Last week, actually, in a press conference, my colleague Genevieve, who was speaking about the hate crimes in South Africa, said something which has really stuck with me, of like the fact that we're not just letters, we're people. And I think the conversation in the global South, particularly around what queer life means, is so much more complex and beautiful and painful, and that's why I think these conversations are very important. But it's also within this context that we're quite excited to be discussing, Rahul, your book, Intimate Archives, the Queer Politics of Postcolonialism, because I think thinking and having these conversations, one, on our own terms, but in ways that often bring about the nuances in arguments, which hasn't really happened. And I think it also very much informs the way in which our contemporary experiences are formed and how we mobilize on this, within the global South. And that's why these conversations are so important. I think it's also important about thinking particularly about these conversations in the current context. Rahul, you had tweeted, I think, in this past week that, we're faced with grimness all around us, and it's often very difficult as queer activists or people within the space to even speak when we know, particularly in South Africa in the last 2.5 months, there have been 6 brutal and horrific hate crimes. In fact, the adjectives don't do it justice any longer. And thinking and hearing about the absolute heart-wrenching stories to have come out from India, very much, I think, at the hands of a delinquent and arrogant government, which doesn't care about people in so many senses. And once again, it's the opportunity for queer people to, despite the harsh realities of our lives, still find moments of intimacy and beauty and grace. And that's not to say that we always have to be resilient and fighters. In fact, I think our humanity comes more from our ability to be fragile, which comes at a huge cost. But that's why I was very excited to have this conversation. And so then in introducing both Rahul and B, instead of going through their kind of bios, which are on the Facebook page, so you can read those. And I often find it embarrassing when people do that with people in the presence. I thought we'd take it back to what is intimate, and to ask you, as a starting point in this conversation, Rahul and B, what does home mean to you? And I can start by saying that if my earliest recollection of home is being 5 or 6 years old, and whenever I visited my grandmother's house in Lenasia, just being embodied with this, with the aroma of baking and the safety that often provided for me, and it's, I think, why I'm so obsessed with baking. And if that isn't queer, then I don't know what is. So yes, Rahul, what is home for you? And I'm very excited to be having this conversation.
Thank you, Keval. Thank you, Srila, Kayo, everybody behind the scenes at Governing Intimacies, and also to you, Keval and B, for being part of this event. If I start with your question, Keval, what does home mean to me? I think home has a kind of double-edged quality for me, because on the one hand, it's a place of belonging and security and feeling safe. But I find that home is also the place that infuriates me and saddens me the most. Things happening at home have a kind of affective pull and an urgency that is impossible to ignore, regardless of where I am. And I feel that very much right now in relation to, I'm sitting in London, but I feel like my heart and my head and everything else is in India, trying to follow what's happening with COVID. And yeah, that's been really hard. So when you ask about home, it sort of evokes all these things in me right now. B, do you want to come in here on the question of home?
Okay, sorry, I was trying to find the unmute. It's quite hard to follow that, Rahul. I think home, when Keval sent that question, as a trans person, home has meant not only a physical outside world to find safety in, but also a kind of consistent movement towards an idea of who I am, but having no clear grounding of where that is and what that is meant to look like. And in some senses, I think that has been, for me, structured around different kinds of homes. So that includes a chosen family that has consistently reflected who I might become. And I mean, Keval is I'm lucky enough to call part of that group of people, to say this is possible because I still keep seeing you in the way you appear before me. And I think I was thinking, when you immediately asked the question, I was like, obviously home is the dance floor, but that is a complete lie since COVID happened. And home,
which is very
now,
sad.
Home now is, which I think I'm also very lucky in, is a food experience. It is, at the moment, it's my partner's amazing tandoori masala and pancakes on a Sunday and watching RuPaul in bed. And both of them are queer in their own very normative home kind of ways.
Great. Back to you, Rahul.
Thank you. I suppose the other way I would think about home is home, sort of riffing off what B just said, home is also about people and projects that we're involved in. Sometimes home doesn't feel very territorial or doesn't feel exclusively territorial. It's also located in these preoccupations. So maybe I'll use that as a point of departure to talk about this project that I've been working on for the last many years, which has, I suppose, culminated in the publication of this book, Out of Time, last year. I imagine most people haven't read it yet, so I want to use my 15 minutes to just say something about the general themes of the book, but also I'll try and zero in on the part of the book that I think engages with the question of the archive and some of the questions that Keval raised most closely. So the book in the first place was provoked by the promulgation of the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act, which I'm sure everyone has heard of and has been following in some way or the other. This is a piece of law that attracted global attention almost immediately for the draconian nature of its provisions. You may recall that in the first draft of the bill, the bill proposed the death penalty for certain categories of offenses, but it also attracted attention for the involvement of mostly US-based Christian evangelical activists who'd been lobbying for the passage of this law. I had assumed when I first heard about this law that precisely because so many Americans were involved in encouraging its passage, this would not be framed by the global press through the rhetorics of homo nationalism, which, as Jasbir Puar has famously taught us, is this phenomenon whereby LGBT rights becomes a marker of a new divide between the civilized and the savage. I was quickly proved wrong, and perhaps I should not have been surprised because, of course, Western media and academia has a way of framing anything that happens in Africa through a very tiresome, well-worn set of stereotypes. And so homo nationalism was pressed into service in describing the crisis around the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act. What we also saw were critiques of this homo nationalism, which were differently problematic in that they seemed to focus attention almost exclusively on the American actors, to the exclusion of the Ugandan priests and politicians who played a very prominent role in bringing this piece of law into effect, into being. Sylvia Tamale, a former dean of the law faculty in Makerere University, was, to my mind, one of the first people saying that this was important, but an inadequate explanation for how this act had come into being. And that led me to want to try to tell a story about Ugandan agency in the production of this piece of law without resorting to these Orientalist homo nationalist tropes that was so common in the usual Western story of this situation. And I tried to do that by drawing attention to a series of transactions between Ugandan and Western elites in different historical moments. And here I was also very influenced by the work of Neville Hode, whose sections of whose African intimacies are very much about Uganda, and which I saw myself as building on and perhaps updating in some sense. So I was interested in transactions between Buganda, the Kingdom of Buganda, this is the largest of the pre-colonial kingdoms that were merged to form the present-day state of Uganda, and its first Western interlocutors, principally through the Anglican and Catholic missionaries who arrived in the 1880s. But I was also interested in encounters between the contemporary Ugandan state and Western actors such as donors, international financial institutions. I became interested in the internal politics of the Anglican Communion, the conversations and interactions between the Church of Uganda and other provinces in the Anglican Communion. And of course, I was interested in encounters between queer activists in the global South and North, and in all of the frictions that we could see in these encounters between North and South in different domains. Many Ugandan scholars and writers were thinking and writing very bravely about the everyday life of the Kuchu community in Uganda. Here I think of Stella Nyanzi's work as one of the first anthropologists and ethnographers working to tell the world about what was unfolding in Uganda. Today, of course, Stella is known in so many other different capacities, but at the time that I was becoming familiar with her work, I knew her primarily as an anthropologist and an ethnographer. So my focus is more on the global frictions of the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And here, one of the things I try to do is I supplement Jaspir Puar's argument about homo nationalism with an argument about what I call Homo Capitalism. And I saw this emerging principally in the reactions of the World Bank and international financial institutions to the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act. So you may know that the World Bank, very soon after the act was passed in February 2014, withdrew a $90 million loan that was meant to have funded maternal health projects. And at the same time, it was also trying to incentivize states to recognize LGBT rights by putting out these reports about how the GDP of a country would grow by X% if it recognized a certain set of rights. So in this way, it was offering both carrots and sticks through the promise of capital infusion and the threat of capital withdrawal if states recognized LGBT rights. And so I was trying to argue, or I am trying to argue through this notion of Homo Capitalism, that the civilizationist logic of Homo nationalism has now to be supplemented with the political economy logic of Homo Capitalism as one of the ways by which global LGBT rights agenda is promulgated in the world today. But I want to come to the question of the archive with which Keval started us off, and in particular with this question of homosexuality being un-African, which was one of the signature claims that queerphobic voices were making in Uganda. This is also reflected in the preamble of the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And of course, this is not a claim that is in any way unique to Uganda. Growing up in India as a queer person, this is something that I heard all the time. Homosexuality is un-Indian, it's culturally inauthentic, it's an import from the decadent, corrupt West, and so on and so forth. In some versions of Hindu right rhetoric, homo nationalism is displaced onto the Muslim other. So we can talk about the varying terrains onto which queerness is displaced by cultural conservatives everywhere. So I became really interested in how activists and academics were combating this sort of queerphobic claim. And of course, one of the most common responses to the claim that homosexuality is Western is to look into the archive, and particularly into the pre-colonial archive, because the pre-colonial period is envisaged as a space-time really that is before contact with the West. And so if we can find signs of same-sex desire in this pre-colonial space-time, we might wield this as a kind of clinching proof that the queerphobic claim that homosexuality is Western is false. Now, we can see that this can be tactically very useful in combating queerphobic claims about the inauthenticity of homosexuality. But many critical theorists, I think, have begun to point out that this way of reaching into the past in this somewhat simplistic fashion for evidence of same-sex desire with which to combat queerphobic claims can be problematic in various ways. So in the first place, it can be anachronistic. To search for signs of gay and lesbian desire in a time and place where such identities would not have been intelligible to non-normative desiring bodies and subjects is historically problematic and anachronistic. We also run the risk of offering, I think, a nostalgic view of the pre-colonial past, in which we imagine it as a space-time in which non-normative desire was celebrated, accepted, and so on and so forth. And I think perhaps we need a more critical view of that pre-colonial past that is able to acknowledge that it might have had its own prejudices and oppressions, but that these were transformed in some way by colonial governmentality. I'm very conscious as a South Asian academic, thinking about caste helps us with this kind of question. The caste system in South Asia is centuries old. It was in no way created by British colonialism. It was in some ways entrenched by colonial governmentality, but it's certainly not an invention. So we have no shortage of pre-colonial prejudices. And I think a meaningful post-colonial theory has to be able to point out not only the legacies of colonialism, but also the ways in which these pre-colonial forms of hierarchy and oppression persist. And I've learned, especially from Anjali Arondekar, whose critique of the instrumentalization of the archive I find very important. In her book, For the Record, she says that this kind of reaching into the archive for evidence of same-sex desire presumes that the archive is itself a kind of passive treasure chest, right? Just a box containing information that we can use. Instead, she encourages us to see the archive as doing something, as producing subjects. I read her work as asking us not just to think about what the archive has, but also to think about what the archive does. In other words, how are we constituted as queer subjects by that very archive and the categories that it is structured around? So the question for me was, might it be possible to draw on the potentially reparative possibilities of a turn towards the past? I am interested in turning towards the past, but can we do this without succumbing to the temptations of empiricism, ventriloquism, anachronism that these critiques are pointing to? And here I became very interested in memory as an alternative to history, as a way of thinking about the past, and particularly in ways of thinking about haunting, the ways in which the past infuses us that are quite difficult to pinpoint and to talk about with precision. We can have a discussion about the difference between memory and history, and perhaps there isn't very much of a difference at all. One way in which that difference is described, I think here of Michel Rolf-Trouillot's work, is to say his starting point is, he says, in the common sense view, history is an account of what actually happened, whereas memory is an account of what people think happened. But of course, we have no access to what actually happened except through someone's account of what they think happened. It's just that some of those accounts become more hegemonic than others, and we end up calling those accounts history. As one of my friends has suggested, perhaps history is just memory with an army. At the same time, I think we maybe want to distinguish between the interpretations that are placed on the past, and perhaps we want to preserve some sense of an authoritative account of what actually happened. Otherwise, we would have nothing to hold on to in response to what's called fake news today, right? So there is a tension here between the desire to tell an authoritative story and the recognition that all stories are informed by particular sets of political interests and are therefore going to be invested in some way or the other. The particular story that I was interested here, and I can only tell you this story very briefly, maybe in 5 minutes, although this is quite ambitious, and I try and go into this in a lot of detail in chapter 3 of the book, is the story of the last pre-colonial ruler of Buganda, Kabaka Mwanga, who is, according to Christian missionary sources, believed to have had sex with men in his court. And all of these words have to be put in inverted commas: sex, men, and we can talk about why all these categories need interrogation. We also have to bear in mind that most of our written sources are colonial Christian missionary sources, which have their own investments in telling the story in a particular way. But that story, as it's typically told, is that Kabaka Mwanga used to have sex with men in his court till the Christian missionaries arrived, converted them to this new religion, taught them that this was a sin, at which point they refused the king his advances. He's enraged, he puts them to death in 1886 in a very public execution, which culminates in a series of civil wars between the Catholics, the Protestants, the Muslims, and the traditionalists. The Protestants emerge triumphant with the help of the Imperial British East Africa Company, and you get the beginnings of British colonial rule in what becomes the Protectorate of Uganda. And the irony in this story for us today is that here you have an instance of thwarted same-sex desire, which is in some way wrapped up in the institution of colonial rule. Whereas contemporary post-colonial elites argue that it's the same-sex desire that is brought in by Western colonialism rather than stamped out. Now, the interesting thing about this story for me is that unlike a lot of same-sex history, it's not buried in an archive. It's not forgotten. It's a very well-known story. Virtually every Ugandan who's had contact with the church or a history book, and this is the overwhelming majority of Ugandans, has an account of the story. It's a very public, intensively memorialized story because the Catholic Church began a campaign to canonize these murdered early Christians. And in the 1960s, the then Pope declared the 23 martyred Catholics saints. So today we have the Uganda Martyrs, who are celebrated by the Catholic Church as martyrs to the religion. And you know, this is a live story. In a sense, there is a live archive to be thought with in connection with this story. And so I, in my work, am interested in how contemporary Ugandans remember this moment. And that led me to have conversations with priests, pilgrims, theology students, everyone who comes to the shrines of the Uganda Martyrs once a year on the 3rd of June, which is remembered as the anniversary of the executions. The executions, the martyrdoms, I should say, are also memorialized in other ways through popular culture, in film. They are, of course, referenced in all histories of Buganda and Uganda. So there are all of these different terrains on which people remember the story of Mwanga and the Uganda Martyrs. And so I was curious about the extent to which the question of same-sex desire entered into the story and entered into people's rememberings and retellings of the story. In my conversations, I encountered 4 kinds of narratives, which I will sum up in 3 minutes. The first kind of, my question to the people I spoke to was quite simple. It was very simply, what do you think happened here? I didn't ask questions about sex or sexuality precisely because I didn't want to fall into these traps of anachronism that I referred to earlier. But if the question of sex came up in these conversations, of course, I was interested in pursuing that and in exploring its implications for how Ugandans today thought about same-sex sexuality. So the first kind of response made no mention of sex or sexuality at all and took the form of, you know, something like this. The king saw Christianity and Jesus Christ as a rival political authority. When he heard these new Christians pray, you know, the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. He interpreted Jesus Christ as a rival political authority and put the pages to death for their political treason. The second kind of story, which came from priests very often, was a very frank acknowledgement that there was a king who desired men, but that this was something that he'd learned from Arab visitors to the court. So this is a 19th century parallel to contemporary practices of displacement, where we displace queerness, same-sex desire onto others. The third kind of narrative I heard was that this was cooked up by missionaries to discredit the king in the eyes of his people. And this was a version that cast skepticism on the authenticity of the sources that we rely on for our account of what happened. And the fourth kind of narrative, which I heard from queer activists and writers and some artists, was an attempt to reclaim the story with all of its dangers, and there are many dangers in attempting to reclaim this story, as evidence that there was a pre-colonial king who expressed desire for same-sex subjects. And that this suggests, at least, that same-sex desire is not culturally inauthentic, right? Now, this, of course, doesn't make it normatively acceptable automatically, but the question of belonging at least gives activists a foothold into a further conversation about normativity, which is why I think these questions about belonging are so important, even if they don't clinch or answer, convince persuasively, definitively, the question about what is normatively acceptable. My own way of navigating these stories was less as somebody interested in telling a single authoritative story about what actually happened in 1886 Buganda. I took the view that memory was important because in some ways it might be politically more consequential than authoritative didactic narratives about history. In other words, what people think happened can be politically more consequential than what actually happened. That doesn't mean that I disavow an interest in what actually happened, but it does mean that we have to keep track both of that preoccupation as well as what people actually think in the everyday. And this is what I've tried to capture. So my vantage point here has been much more that of a curator of these different versions. And I've been interested in historicizing them and trying to illuminate what is at stake in these different ways of remembering the past, rather than attempting to settle once and for all what might actually have happened. I was also very conscious of my positionality as an outsider to Uganda, and I did not think it was my place to offer that authoritative story. There's a very complicated politics of positionality, I think, that one has to think through in thinking about how one can intervene in these situations without causing damage. And of course, that was uppermost in my mind through the course of researching this. So I think I'll stop here because I'm really keen to hear from Bea and others. I've only been able to present a small snapshot of what is a much more complicated story about the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act and its global ramifications. But I thought that this would be the angle that might most interest this audience, given the overall themes and interest in archives. And I wanted to present this as a particular way of thinking about an archive, a living archive that I had to construct for myself in a sense through these enormously interesting conversations with very different people in Uganda. Thank you.
Rahul, you've left us with so much, and it was very exciting being able to kind of think of moments or instances in the Gala archive that really speak to the way in which you framed it. But I'm going to let Bea come in here and do the real intellectual work.
Well, we hope. Thank you, Rahul. That was incredible, and after having read the book so many times, it's always still great to hear you talk about it out loud. So Out of Time for me was one of my lockdown reads, lockdown one that is, and so I imagine in a lot of ways it's always going to hold a kind of special place for me. As many other people who've engaged with this book and your work have said, it's written with immense care. It's generous thinking, and there's a real intellectual curiosity. And you really touch on that in your presentation, also talking about, thinking through your positionality, which we know doesn't in writing about issues or experiences in the Global South isn't often or isn't taken into account as often as it should be. It also does the incredible theoretical linking that I think many scholars will draw from, particularly those working on projects in the Global South. The generosity of this work is evident from the outset, and perhaps no better exemplified than in the 2 or so pages where you dedicate a discussion to intersectionality and assemblage. And this discussion, literally 2 pages, rich, basically debunks any misunderstanding of assemblage as oppositional to intersectionality, and is now, from now on for me, required reading to all my students. One of the key offerings that I think this book's make, and which you highlight in the keynote role, is the troubling of this narrative that has, I think, so easily become the hill on which African LGB politics, and I mean LGBT, has come to sacrifice itself on. The question that Kevil mentioned also in the beginning that this narrative hinges on is, what is un-African, homophobia or homosexuality? Which of these is the kind of culturally inauthentic interloper? You, as you've just spoken about in your presentation, use Uganda to provide a crucial example of the kind of discursive constructions of homophobia and how this debate about so-called un-Africanness folds in myriad ways, and how we can look backwards and forwards to see its various linkages. Out of Time not only notes the inconsistencies in this debate, but it also does some immensely heavy lifting in linking this debate to a global flow of people, capital, ideas, and terms between former colonies and the colonial metropole. And I think that that's where I want to lend my small offering to this discussion in relation to this idea of flow. As many of us know, yesterday in South Africa was a public holiday, Freedom Day. It is a cruel reminder of how far we have yet to go, that the day before Freedom Day, queer and trans South Africans across the country had to march and gather publicly for two reasons. The first is a call to end what is now being termed a hate crime wave against queer and trans individuals after the brutal murders of Lonwabo, Lulu, Nathaniel, and Sipamandla. And the second to show solidarity with the predominantly Ugandan LGBTQI refugees encamped in Kakuma camp in Kenya. This is in the wake of an arson attack which left one of the members of that community dead. Both of these events read to me as indicative of the ways that the underpinnings of the debate about Pan-Africanness continue to inform conditions of life and death, and I'll expand on this a little bit more shortly. In this way, these events are very much linked to this discussion about what kinds of queer politics become possible in the aftermath of colonialism, the question that kind of leads this, this webinar. Rahul, your work points to the coloniality of post-colonial African states in not only vehemently upholding laws which criminalize queer and trans people, but in some cases, as with Uganda, reinventing and reinscribing those laws in far harsher terms than previously. You suggest that in the scramble to say that homophobia is a colonial import, there's been a seeming denial of post-colonial agency in understanding how many post-colonial nations have made persecutory laws their own, or what you term, and I really like this, a homo-romanticist tendency to absolve African actors of responsibility for the production of homophobia. Kind of pivoting all the way around back to the archive, I think important for us to consider in a webinar series entitled Intimate Archives. You note, on the other hand, that there has been an archival turn, an effort to use the archive to ground this idea of homosexuality in the pre-colonial past, to target various archival threads in order to weave this pre-colonial past, to say, but look, this has always been, you just may not have named it homosexuality. This also romanticizes the pre-colonial past. As you point out in your work, drawing on the scholarship of Anjali Arundaka, what this does is discount and perhaps most dangerously foreclose the possibility that there may also have been historical animosity, and you speak about that, towards expressions of sexuality outside of heterosexuality. Something Kagura Machera critiques as an investment in the pre-lapsarian, which seeks the true Africa in the honorable and static pre-colonial past. I think one of the crucial interjections I think you make with flagging this idea of homo-romanticism is that in absolving African states from their homophobia, both in the present and in the imagined past, we overlook the possibility of a set of mutually constitutive relations between former colony and colonial power with regards to framing, understanding, and perhaps weaponizing sexuality, which play out both in this present and into our future. This has particular repercussions for present debates within queer African studies. For example, in light of the Pan-African debate, it becomes difficult to frame or understand the wave of decriminalization of LGBT people that's taken place now in Angola, Mozambique, Gabon, Botswana, and the Seychelles in the last few years. And I like the fact that you noted the kind of role of media in this in the beginning of your discussion, because there seems to have been very little interest in this kind of wave of decriminalization. However, the Pan-African debate makes it deceptively easy to frame, although difficult to completely believe or indeed stomach, the ramping up of homophobia in Ghana, the increased criminalization and incarceration of trans people in Cameroon, and the clampdown through mandated police squadrons tasked with hunting LGBT people in Tanzania. It seems to me that one of the serious interventions that Out of Time makes is the suggestion that continuing to focus on the dichotomy of homophobia, homosexuality, hobbles our ability to diversify debates and rights claims. And as Spivak reminds us, human rights appear to be something we cannot not want. I want to turn you to the question which is posed by Jasper Poor more than once in the opening chapter: what do we do when we get what we want? Is what we want a series of rights enshrined in the Constitution? And what do we do when we get that? It would seem to me that in South Africa, we see a version of this homo-romanticism embedded in both the nation of South African exceptionalism and South Africa as the West of the South. On either reading, there seems to be no way to apportion responsibility to African actors for the production of protections. These are all rather understood as arising from conditions imposed by the global North, unshaped by global South agency. There are no post-colonial protections offered here, only ways in which to implement Northern desires. Yet your book reminds us to focus on the ways we already see the operations and flows of global South agency, that South Africa can protest the treatment of refugees in Kenyan refugee camps, for example. Those refugees are a direct outcome of the particular queer politics of postcoloniality in your book. Another example might be the recent discussions for legal gender recognition, which in the Botswanan case noted the Indian decisions referenced in your book, and in the South African case drew on both Nepalese and Indian constructions of gender recognition, dangerously suggesting that trans people in South Africa are somehow a traditional third category akin to the Hijra. And I want to end on this question of gender. I've tried to gesture to some of the ways your book offers us tools to begin to shift the dichotomy of this debate about homosexuality and Africanness, and consider the agency of post-colonial African states. I also wonder more generally how long LGBT people have to exist before they become African. What is the use by date on this idea of un-Africanness? I want to suggest that the development of trans rights and visibility might offer some insights here. It cannot be overlooked that the LGBT movement in Uganda has significant trans visibility, the impact of which might be seen in the strange wording of the eventual Anti-Homosexuality Act, which seemingly couldn't figure out if it wanted to criminalize sexuality in relation to gender or in relation to sex. So if you read the act, it kind of switches between criminalizing same-sex acts to criminalizing same-gender acts, and neither of which is entirely clear as to what is actually being referred to. So looking at the trans archive on the African continent, we see an emergent visibility that is very much grounded in the now, reaching for a term that has traveled and is invested in the present. In my own work, I accept that we can't separate the question of gender from sexuality. However, there does seem to be a danger in using the one to stand in for the other, or as has happened in the past, particularly in the global north, allowing queer to speak for trans. Throughout your book, of course, the focus is very much on queer. As much as I was excited to come to the end, and I'm kind of sad this wasn't mentioned or part of your presentation, at the last chapter in the book focuses on trans politics in India. And I was super excited to come to this chapter, but I have to admit that I felt a little like reaching the end of the acronym with the T tagged on the end. I suppose my closing kind of meandering question for you all is about this final chapter of your book, which deals with trans identity and politics and the Nalsa judgment in India, and is called The Nation and Its Queers. My question is the nation and its queers really the nation and its queer and trans people? A little clunkier, I admit, but I suppose what I'm asking as I consider this flow of ideas, language, and people related to gender and this judgment in particular, which seems to be being taken up elsewhere in quite different ways. So there's no kind of accusation about this judgment, about it being an imposition or kind of global northern idea from the difference, for instance, in South Africa's enshrining of gay rights in the Constitution. Might we not have more to gain from seeing transness as doing something with and in relation to queerness in postcoloniality rather than as queerness itself?
Oh. Rahul, do you want to have any immediate responses to that?
Thank you so much, B. Those were really stimulating, interesting, wonderful comments. And I'm really grateful for your deep engagement with the book. You've said a bunch of things that not many other people have said, so you've really given me things to think about. I think I'd like to just begin with the last point that you ended on, because I think that's really important. I agree with you that I find gender and sexuality very hard to separate. And I want to give an example of why that is true, even in respect of the story that I told about Moanga. So one of the most interesting pieces of work that I came across was work by Sylvia Nanyonga Tamusuza, who's an ethnomusicologist, who I think has written most illuminatingly about the gender landscape of 19th century Buganda. Her work, which is mostly, as I gathered, done through oral history, tells us that gender in 19th century Buganda was a function of not just anatomy or readings of anatomy, but also of royal status and of physical space. So she tells us that if one was royal, one was gendered male, and if one was a commoner, one was gendered female. And she also tells us about the ways in which these genderings, the genderings of commoners, changed depending on where they were physically located, inside the palace, outside the palace. And that kind of work introduces the possibility that what 19th century Baganda, if Kabaka Mwanga was engaged in corporeal intimacies with commoners, what 19th century Baganda might have seen as opposite sex desire was reinterpreted, recoded, miscoded by Christian missionaries as same-sex desire. And so you have in this original textual moment of the recording of non-normative desire, you have an instance of misgendering, which accounts for the attitudes of these Christian missionaries. And so in the context of that archival moment, I think here is a moment in which gender and sexuality become quite inseparable from one another. I think this is probably why I was using queer as an overarching category throughout the book. And I use trans much more specifically when I'm talking about transness on its own terms. But I suspect that the reason that last chapter is called The Nation and its Queers rather than The Nation and its Trans subjects, or The Nation and its Queer and Trans, is precisely because of this difficulty for me of separating gender from sexuality. I don't know if that's an adequate response to your question, but that's where I was coming from, I think.
No, I mean, I suppose I wanted to, and as someone doing this kind of work, this is an ongoing question in terms of queer African studies. Where does transness fit, and how do we begin to think about gender in these particular ways? So a lot of what I was reading from your work was a kind of injunction to also think about how do we talk about both and separate.
Yeah.
And how does that fit within the kinds of conversations we want to have, particularly when we have a dichotomous debate grounded very much in this idea of sexuality, which doesn't always function very well for the ways in which we need to begin to think about these subjects. So that was very helpful, Rahul. Thank you.
Just a point that I want to reflect on in listening to your conversations, and this comes more from the perspective of the practice of an archive, like what is the role of Gala in terms of meeting these these key challenges. And I was reflecting quite a lot on the conversation that we had when Urvashi Butalia was here speaking about Mona, and in relation to CUPE, and the failures of not only the English language, but the language that we have available as historians and archivists and activists in bringing these stories to light, and then why, particularly in the parallels between these two individuals' lives from seemingly different parts of the world, and yet there was this kind of link which was important to discuss from a global South perspective, which created this connectivity and allowed us to really challenge and give us a challenge for the archive on what language could do. I mean, both CUPE and Mona never spoke in the language of trans, and yet so much of the laws and the systems of oppression were directed at them in very similar ways. And I suppose it then goes back to this question of how and why it's important that we're not only using the archive to challenge what is coming from outside, so this Western crusade for queer rights, but I think our challenge, particularly within the global South, is one, the question of memory and everyone having a different sense of memory, which I think is so important and powerful in a queer archive. Even the sense of like the recording the stories of gossip, which I think is such an important form of historical recollection. It's almost as if our responsibility is so huge, but it also makes the archive so much richer.
In that, the chapter that I spoke about, I think I'm playing with the meaning of remembering in different ways. And this is why there's also a cutesy little hyphen there in that word. And so at one level, I'm trying to think with people who are recalling something that is perhaps forgotten. Although part of what interests me about that story is it's not forgotten. It's very heavily memorialized, but in different ways. But I think I'm also playing with the idea of, the word member as sexual organ. I'm trying to reinsert the question of desire into a story where it's sometimes been written out, or it's sometimes been written in all sorts of different ways. But I'm also thinking about membership in the political community. To remember is to reinsert, perhaps even forcefully, oneself into a political community from which one has been excluded, insofar as one does want exclusion. Many of us don't want inclusion. So there's that also at stake, I think, in this question of archives and remembering. It is, Arendt famously talked about the right to have rights, right? Before one can deploy them, one has to be able to be recognized as a subject who even has the right to have an argument about having them or not having them. And this is where recognition of one's humanity almost becomes a precondition to wielding something that are, things called human rights. So I think those are the things that are at stake in this question of memory, having a place in the archive, having an archive, creating an archive, forcing somebody to recognize that something is an archive, even when it's not seen as such.
I know that we're running very short on time here, but I'm sure that people would give us, particular speakers would give us some leeway here. There are three questions. One is by Fatima, who asks specifically about the discussion of what the archive does, and as in the action that it takes. And she was wondering if you could discuss the creation of the said archive and how that affects the actions that it takes. I suppose, who does the archive belong to in a way? Which I think is also a very challenging question for queer archives.
Yeah, and I'm happy for B and Keval to also interrupt and offer your own perspectives on this question. But I suppose the way I would comment that question is, when we think about what the archive does, it's really important, I think, to bear in mind the categories around which the archive is structured. These categories are never natural, right? They are constructed, and there are histories of struggle that go into producing those categories. Sometimes we might recognize ourselves in those categories, and other times we might not. And even when we don't, our histories might nonetheless be located within these categories. I remember listening to a very interesting presentation from a queer archivist who told us that, before a certain year, one had to look under categories like perversion in order to access a history of queerness or transness or same-sex desire. And so the story of the categories is almost as perhaps even more important than what's filed within them. And that's what I'm getting at, I think, with this notion of what archives do.
B?
I mean, yeah, I think the archives that I work with are a lot more recent in some ways, and there is a real question around, and I like the kind of injunction around the notion of the categories, because I think I allude to it a little bit in what I'm saying, that there's a particular way in which we see transness being understood in the global north. We see a particular way of transness appearing in India in the ways in which this community is framed. And we see an outward flow of that being taken up, in, for instance, Botswana or South Africa, and framing a community that doesn't exist in that way, to assume that then that somehow makes them possible rights bearers. I don't know why it keeps coming up to me, but there's a great, well, not great, it's a really trashy Nollywood film in 4 parts. It's on YouTube. But one of the things that happens in it is that this Nigerian goes to America and transitions and returns to Nigeria as a woman. And eventually at the end of the series, the family convinces her to detransition and they send her to India to do that. And there's something really interesting in what is it imagined that other global South nations can do that is a perversion from the global North. And yet when we look at what comes out in this judgment is a particular understanding and an affirmation of transness in a slightly different way. And those are all part of that archive, and archives which I feel are almost sitting next door, touching one another in various different ways.
That's so interesting, B. And I'm also really intrigued by what you've been saying about the way in which the Nalsa judgment has been taken up in other places, and the way in which it's been made to do work, often quite uncomfortable forms of work. I think the thing I would add to that is that the Nalsa judgment is problematic even within the context of Indian transness. A, because of the diverse ways in which Hijra is identified. B, because it was so it took very little cognizance of other forms of transness within India. Trans masculinity barely registers in the judgment. And so there have been a lot of very strong Indian trans critiques of that judgment, which is perhaps useful to bear in mind when it's taken to other global South locations. And
it is, I mean, it is something that I'm desperate to write about at some point, but those critiques, from what I have read of the critiques that emerge in India, are the very same critiques that emerge in other places where it's picked up on. But there's a kind of, what I see from the way the judgment is used is that there's a desperation for legalese from the global South that would make these categories acceptable without this accusation of it's the North, it's the North, it's the North. But at the same time, it then struggles with what we have as a diversity of being.
We maybe then need to start talking about imperialisms of the global South in the global South. And, you know, this is where perhaps post-colonial theory has to move.
Well, I think it's very interesting, Rahul, that you also speak about the particularly global funders and what the expectations are, and how there is a huge push towards judgments and legal action. And I think that there is a moment, even in the South African context, of like real soul searching of like, the law effectively has failed us, or we can go to our community and they say that this means very little in my ability to live a life of freedom and dignity and all of that. And so how, thinking about the Nalta, also Jade September case of trans prisoner who's been given the judgment, but clearly no rights that are afforded by the state inaction. So, and I think an archive there is particularly important, also creating a community and a movement around how we shift within these spaces where, we're still challenging state institutions and laws, or inaction of legal judgments in so many ways. There was a question here from Jabu from Iranti, who asked a question around centering white supremacy in the current embodiment of how we capture queer bodily trauma, Black body joy. And I also want to perhaps draw a parallel, particularly in the Indian context, to caste systems and the hierarchy of that, particularly in the violence, particularly against queer Dalits. It feels that speakers are extractive of race, and hence racism is not centered at all.
Yeah, I hope that the book doesn't do that. And in fact, there are very extensive chapters in the book that are very, very much center the question of race and caste. And in fact, one of the things that I try and do is I examine queerness through a series of different lenses as the book goes along. In the UK context in particular, I became very interested in the ways in which British activists, British LGBT activists, were trying to make sense of the historic responsibility of Britain in exporting anti-sodomy laws to other parts of the Commonwealth. And there's a very peculiar discourse unfolding in Britain where we see British LGBT activists, and I'm talking about elite mainstream activists, and politicians and parliamentarians who have been willing to express a kind of atonement for the export of anti-sodomy laws under colonialism, but not for other aspects of colonialism, such as slavery, to name the most obvious. And I argue in the book that this is because of an elision between queerness and whiteness in the British political imaginary, which allows for a certain kind of atonement around the sexual and homosexual legacies of colonialism, but not around the racial legacies of colonialism. Not that these things are separable, but the point is that in the political imaginaries of these elites, the question of sexuality and race tends to be segregated when they reckon with the legacies of colonialism in a way that's extremely problematic. So I think that white supremacism is absolutely integral to the way in which queerness is imagined, particularly in a place like Britain today. And so that's the way in which I try and center the question of race in thinking about the sort of afterlives of colonialism in this book.
Do you have any?
I mean, I don't think that, I think that was more directed at the general discussion. I mean, I center race quite often in my work, and perhaps not in this response talking in a kind of broader sense, but and I feel as a white researcher, that's something that I am often beholden to do and should be doing, and that comes up quite often in my work. But there is a kind of and Jabu's question is on point about a kind of dissonance of talking about Black trauma versus Black joy, and being able to draw on that as the subject matter without actually engaging the reality of those lives. And there has been a kind of extractive process as we've seen, but hopefully discussions like this, and I think the way in which Rahul particularly manages it in the book, and looking to like what it can be apologized for and how far can we go in that apology, provides instances in which we can begin to think through how race centers both in both in the, sorry, I lost track of thought, a comment just came up in the chat. It gives examples of how we can begin to weave this into the work that we do.
I'm going to summarize this last question because I think it is important and it kind of does link. But and I think the important question here is something that we spoke about, particularly about the current context that we all find ourselves in, which relates to kind of gender-based hate crimes, which are not, I mean, prevalent in South Africa, but pretty much all over world, and it's often hard, particularly being in the space, to realize just the sheer level of hatred there is for like queer lives, walking, living, breathing on the streets. You know, I think part of that's why a queer archive also has to speak to the joy and the beauty and the love through things like through literature, through stories, through poetry, which is why I'm very excited that Maneo has asked this question. And she was wondering what does it do to those of us deeply invested in the work of queer memory, which is, you know, it's often exhausting and so traumatic. And how do we remember or historicize this moment? You know, those of us without armies, as she puts it.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I've been thinking about this in the context of COVID, and I don't have a very well thought through response, but just looking at Twitter and social media, for example, those of us without armies memorialize COVID in this way. And even this has become a battleground because, you know, the government of India is leaning on Twitter to remove tweets that are critical of the way in which it responds to the COVID pandemic. So social media is as much of a battleground. It's an archive, sure, but it's not an archive that we have complete control over. I've also been thinking a lot about 1918 to 20, right? The so-called Spanish flu. There's politics around even that term, but you know, a time in which 15 million Indians perhaps died in a pandemic where the worldwide toll was huge, unimaginable. And one really intriguing question that Laura Spinney asks in her book on the 1918 pandemic, Pale Rider, is how is it that we have memorialized the World War I dead, but not the flu dead in this moment? They're both happening at the same time. I think that raises questions about what it is we choose to memorialize and choose to remember. And perhaps this time round will be very different, but it is an intriguing question to ask, I think, about 1918. Why do we remember certain kinds of dead? And that's wrapped up in ideas about heroism and valor versus unheroic death. And perhaps this is a broader question also about grievable lives and the logics of grieving that we adopt in different historical moments. So, you know, apologies, that was a diffuse answer to a quite sharp and specific question, but I hope also one that reflects the range of things that we're trying to archive at the moment.
Yes, thank you so much. We are running out of time, and I know there's just so much to discuss, but perhaps if we could just have some final points of reflection, and B, maybe perhaps we can start with you, and then Rahul, move to you.
I think there's so much to think about here. And there's so many comments that I keep getting kind of drawn into the comment section and wanting to engage with. So I just want to thank everyone for their comments and not being able to answer everyone directly. This Zoom also seems to have a strange setting where if I respond to one person, it goes to everyone. So there's no way to directly engage for panelists. Rahul, I've really enjoyed this discussion with you. I really have so much to take from your book and use it elsewhere. And really, I feel like I could like write another book of my own that was just basically cribbing from your book and adding my own like things in, but everyone would know it was yours. But so I just want to thank you for this discussion and for like the really amazing thinking you do in the work.
Thank you, B. That's really kind and generous of you. I guess my hope is not really to have told a definitive story, but to have raised a set of questions about time and to try and illuminate what is at stake in thinking about questions around queer politics temporally. Why is it that we reach into the past? What are the ways in which we think about and conjure up futures, which we haven't talked about that much in this conversation, but the question of futurity is also really central to the book. We are, I think, always already talking about time, and all I've tried to do here is to try and make that visible and to think about what's at stake in particular ways of talking about the past and the future in queer struggle. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Rahul and B, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we actually did it this time. I feel like I deeply needed to have this sense of community where we spoke about important things and spoke about it coming from the heart. In that regard, I was reflecting on why particularly these conversations are so important, and your book and the amount of work that has gone into and thoughtfulness that has gone into it, Rahul. And it's a quote by Zanele Muholi where they mention, if I wait for someone else to validate my existence, it will mean that I'm shortchanging myself. And we won't allow that for ourselves. So thank you so much for everyone who's participated in this. And I'm sorry we didn't get through to all of the conversations. Once again, thank you to Governing Intimacies for hosting this important conversation. And then just a note, I know that there's a question of accessibility of your book, Rahul, in South Africa, but we'll work in order to ensure that we at least have some copies in the archive, and I suppose we can then make arrangements for people to perhaps have them. But yeah, and then to everyone within this panel, please stay safe and take care of yourselves, and I hope you have a gentle week. Thank you so much, everyone.
Just quickly, there's a free copy of the book on Z Library. So if anybody wants a free PDF, head over to Z Library and you'll find it there.
Don't say we're not generous, people. Thanks very much.